Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Kaimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna.
Pakardia is an enormous island. While its land and people are considered part of the known world, the Picardiant are reclusive and generally mistrusting of outsiders. Even though they were among the Assembly's most vocal advocates in the Amazon Accord and have a higher opinion of humans than most Chimerans, few in the Assembly have been granted permission to interview its people, study its ecology, or even set foot on the island. There are many religions of the Picardiant, but most have fairly stringent commandments on the treatment of animal remains. While there have been many field studies in Pakardia from both the Great Library and the Assembly, it is rare for remains to be permitted to be removed from the island for further study, peer review, and catalogue, as this removes them from the reincarnation cycle of the Picardiant religion. Remains can be removed, but they must be brought back to continue this reincarnation cycle. All this means both the Great Library and Assembly know less about the residents of Pakardia than they do many of the regions beyond the known world. Even some of their larger and more common megafauna have only recently come close to a full understanding. Perhaps there is no better example of this than the Tarraconcha, Pakardia's mastodont. A gauntlet of mistranslation and poor identification of the few Picardian specimens in the Assembly archives, most of which have now been returned for over a century, means the true identity of this animal has long been misunderstood. Early Assembly accounts call this animal the dire boar, or capratrox. It was assumed to be a large suid based on how it was described by the indigenous peoples. The Great Library described it as a species of tuga, or small insular elephant, living on Picardia alongside the giant boar, not knowing these two were the same animal and sharing only distant relationship with the elephantid tuga of the Caline Sea. Back in the late 1800s, when the Assembly returned most of their Picardian collections, naturalist Anna Johnson noted the Tarraconcha skull in their collections had teeth clearly identifying it as a mastodont. But as this and other specimens were being packed up and shipped back to Pakardia, her observation was only vindicated in modern times when a team of photographers were permitted study within Confederacy territory. Mastodonts have a long history in Kaimere. A few partial remains suggest Gomphotheres, most successful in the first harvest after the dynastic extinction, may have had a few mastodont neighbors. However, 12 million years ago, the Asian harvest brought several species, and for a time they were the most successful clade of Proboscideans in Kaimere, at least in some regions like southern Nikar. The last Miocene North American harvest saw further mastodonts introduced to Kaimere. They weren't as large, but were far more successful in Arvel, being the dominant Proboscidean in the continent throughout the Anchored period. The end of the Anchored period saw the extinction of most of these mastodonts, with the last member holding out in Qajar until they too went extinct with the arrival of the first children around 13,000 years ago. The fossil record of Picardia is poorly sampled, but it is believed that Tarraconcha is descended from Arvelith mastodonts that until recently lived in the free states of Kadan. The Kadaneth hunted their local tuga to extinction for their ivory, but it is documented that there were as many as 3 different kinds: a grazing tuga, a browsing specialist, and a generalist. All were fairly small, around or under a ton. There are accounts of some surviving tuga in the highlands of Kadan, but these appear to all be the same endangered species, a Paleoloxodon. However, skeletal remains of some lowland browsing tuga have indeed been verified to be a species of mastodont. Accounts from back when these animals were alive say that these larger, more aggressive tuga were the males of the generalist tuga species, but again it is now known that they are distinct animals. It is unknown why, of the 3 species of Tuga in Kadan, only the Mastadon appear to have successfully made the crossing from Kadan to Pakardia. To be fair, it's entirely possible that others did, but the Mastodon of Kadan is the only one with living descendants on Pakardia. The Tarakancha is not as small as their Kadanith ancestors, growing larger once they reached Pakardia, but are still quite small compared to extinct mastodons on mainland Kaimere, such as Kajar. Unusual for Proboscideans, most assembly texts refer to males as boars and females as sows. This is a reflection of their original translation, being an assumption that they are among the suids. Sows weigh up to 2 tons, though most average closer to 1. Boars are notably larger, with average boars weighing between 2.5 to 3 tons, and alleged yet unverified 5-ton boars in the highlands. This renders them less than half the size of the extinct Kajarith mastodon, but still among the larger residents of Pakardia. Like the olifant, they are fairly short in height and long-bodied compared to elephants, though they are not as laterally compressed as olifants. While they superficially resemble mammoths and other elephants, they are separated by as much as 30 million years of evolution. Their teeth are their most famous difference. Like olifants, the teeth of Tarachunka have numerous protuberances from the base to better crush and shear branch and shrub, while elephant teeth have a more intricate ridged surface adapted to grind tougher abrasive vegetation like grass. However, comparing living Tarachunka to mammoths of southern Arvel and the dwarf elephants throughout the Kaline Islands shows their distant relationship in a range of behavioral and anatomical details. The ears of Tarachunka more closely resemble those of a hyrax, elephant's closest living relative on Earth, than the ears of mammoths or other Chimeran Proboscideans. The tip of their trunk looks in some ways more like the snout of a pig, albeit with a finger-like point at the top. Like the Gomphothir olifants, which may be their closest relative, although this relationship is debated, they have tusks on their lower jaw. However, the tusks of these Tarachunka are much smaller. Juveniles have a short but dense coat of fur. It remains as the animal ages, though becomes sparse past the shoulders. In large boars, it is often barely visible, save for a striking russet to gold fur along their forelegs, neck, and face. Both sexes grow a dorsal crest of fur and a dewlap hanging from their throat, though both are far more pronounced in the males. There are a number of convergent points between them and distantly related Proboscideans. Their lower jaw became short, and in most individuals, the long tusks twist up. It is unknown why they resemble elephants in these ways, as they retain the browsing specialization of their ancestors, but it has been suggested that their ancestry on Kadan, where they had few natural predators, may have seen them become more focused on combating one another. Shorter mandibles and upturned tusks may be more conducive to fighting others of their kind than the downturned tusks of their ancestors. Olifants use these tusks oriented down, mostly to facilitate browsing. Tarachunka feed mostly with their trunk, perhaps freeing their tusks to be more employed as weapons than browsing implements, and the trunk-focused browsing may have benefited from shorter mandibles, independent from the elephant condition. In most boars, the tusks twist and angle up as much as 90 degrees. However, in some individuals, the tusks grow straight or even angle downward like those of an olifant. The L shape of these tusks are believed to better facilitate non-lethal engagement. Perhaps due to conflict with the Picardiant, they are generally rare in the lowlands. However, in the highlands and along the more arid southern coast, herds of Tarachunka are fairly commonly seen. Like other Proboscideans, females live in groups of 3 to 10 related cows and their young, while males tend to live in bachelor herds of usually unrelated individuals. Mixed-sex herds are common where their ranges intersect with Oritaku and Weochituka in the highlands, though in the lowlands they tend to segregate by sex. While males are quite tolerant and even affectionate toward other boars in their bachelor herds for most of the year, this tolerance evaporates when the dry season comes. Indeed, boar tarachunka are extremely violent in their duels even with individuals who are their friends when the rains return. Tarachunka do not go through must, instead having a seasonal rut in the brief winters that pause the otherwise perpetual rains pouring over Pakardia. The face of boars are routinely scarred from these encounters, where all four tusks are employed in an effort to dominate the competition. Size is often more a deciding factor over tusks in these encounters, which may account for the dimorphism of this species. Males often weigh twice as much as sows when they stop growing, averaging greater dimorphism than many other species of Proboscidean. Through most of the year, however, they are much more amiable toward one another. Boars who were actively trying to gore one another to severe injury will be polite and even playful with one another a few weeks later. Sometimes they will even gently touch injuries they themselves inflicted. Like other Proboscideans, they are extremely intelligent animals. Maybe the surge of testosterone in the mating season is so disorienting that they don't have much discernment or control, and go through great lengths to mend a bond afterward. According to the Picardiant, the boars seem to regard these violent duels as nothing personal, simply what must be done, and even make sure to clear any tension with play and the exchange of gifts in the form of choice food in its aftermath once the rage of winter calms. Tarachunka are conifer specialists, with these plants making up almost their exclusive diet. Their formidable teeth enable them to chew through branches, pine cones, and bark with ease. In the highlands, Tarachunka compete with Girazent for conifer needles and berries, though these sauropods don't go after the tougher parts of the plant that mastodons seem to prefer. Young Girazent are a greater challenge, especially since they are far more abundant than the high-browsing adults, but the two can often browse in the same trees without tremendous intersection. The moose and anemotu are perhaps their most direct competition, though these giant ungulates are more generalist browsers and part-time grazers, often favoring sedges, grass, and reeds where mastodon are abundant. Tarachunka are proficient swimmers and climbers, better than anemotu or Girazent, which does enable them to access a range of foliage the competition tends to avoid. In the highlands, sloths prefer grass, Sonjaku hippos tend to target this food in the lowlands, and Barafont along the southern coast. Only the hippos are grass specialists, and the other two will partake in some conifer browsing. Pakardiant common drakes and the Kodoran koku also both dabble in conifers, but neither specialize. Where they do coincide with these generalists and grazers, Tarachunka aren't much competition due to specializing in that which most herbivores show less interest in. The Angaru, Pakardia's giant gibbon, also feeds on a lot of needles, cones, and conifer berries, and they sometimes eat saplings and branches too, given their own fierce chewing apparatus, but these enormous apes rare and defer to mastodons when they come around. The Urutumotu, Pakardia's giant simiomorph sloth, also competes with mastodon for food, and avoids them on account of their much smaller size. The sloth is a very proficient climber, enabling them to avoid direct competition for the lower branches. Perhaps the strangest competition is the emerald phabodont. Though there are many peculiar traits of this creature, most relevant are their nominative bean-shaped teeth, which grow out to fill the jaws and palate, enabling them to process bark, root, and wood. They are short animals and cannot climb, so don't compete with mastodons for browsing, but will chew through the base of favored trees and eat the new shoots that mastodon often like, so are technically competitors, even if they're not much bigger than a newborn Tarachunka. More than competing, the emerald phabodont contributes to the turnover of the mastodon food source, helping to maintain a robust foundation of fresh growth in these extremely verdant forests. They may have their competition, but nothing beats the Tarachunka at their own game. Specializing in the most abundant food source means they can reliably get by even in a fairly stacked niche. In Picardia, where a vast majority of the land is a temperate rainforest, there's plenty of food for these persistent herbivores. For the most part, only the two large theropods of Pakardia are their predators. Oritaku can kill even a large boar tarachunka, which is likely why these mastodons are social. Weotituka can also bring them down, able to endure formidable retaliation thanks to their thick armored hide. Indrakai, red panthers, and leopards have all been said to kill mastodons, though as the Assembly has had very few missions in Pakardia, verifying any of these claims about fauna in the island is always going to be challenging. The Boar clan is one of the great lowland clans who first formed the Confederacy. In the aftermath of the Barren Plague, which was spread by hogs now feral on the island, the clan altered this affiliation, or at least clarified that it was the Tarachunka who represented them. In addition to being a patron spirit of this major clan, the Tarachunka is also a popular personal patron spirit for Picardian warriors, wrestlers, and physical laborers. The Boar clan is said to be the warriors of the Confederacy. While all clans, both major and minor, contribute Karaton warriors to the defense of their people, it must be said that the Tarakawa Karatoans typically comprise half or more of all warriors when the Confederacy marshals an army. In the years before the unification, back when the Panther clans, clans of the Spine, and the Highlander tribes would sometimes make war with the Picardiant, it was the Boar clan whose land bordered their rivals and their warriors who defended the Confederacy. Perhaps surprisingly, they hold the fewest grudges among the clans, welcoming all three factions into their confederacy without resistance, while the other clans voice their qualms. The Boar clan are said to take a similar approach to warfare as their namesake. They fight with violent ferocity when the time comes, but are happy to make amends when the battle concludes. It is likely that they would not take well to betrayal, but each of the joining factions has stood by their alliances after the treaties were ratified, and the Boar clan has upheld peace and are indeed often the diplomats facilitating disputes among the different factions because of this reputation. Tarachunka themselves are sometimes ridden into battle or used for labor by members of the Boar clan, but they are not officially domesticated. The Boar clan are very protective of these beasts, and one of the few laws they fiercely protect is the taboo against the exploitation of Tarachunka. They claim they can communicate with these mastodons. The Tarachunka they ride are said to consent to whatever they do. Water buffalo, imported from the Empire, have replaced much of the old use of tamed Tarachunka and other beasts of this body plan throughout the Confederacy, as they are strong, obedient, able to more readily cooperate, and are much easier to feed and keep than wild animals. There is a misconception and often mistranslation of the Tarakawa as the Buffalo clan, since they promote the use of these beasts of burden and labor, and while many carry sigils of the buffalo, it is not their clan symbol or patron. The only other known mastodon in Kaimere is found in Daidosozatsuba Island, or the Blackfish Island. This region is even less accommodating to assembly research than Pakardia. Indeed, they are outright hostile, rather than merely having a religious creed to keep remains on their island as the Picardian do for their system of reincarnation, and very little is known of this mastodon aside from a few skeletal elements and a pelt. Grizzleback Oliphant, or Mastodon, are generally the common names for this animal. It is assumed the Grizzleback leads a similar life to the Picardian Mastadon, but the only major expedition ended with most of the crew being captured and presumably cannibalized by the locals following a violent altercation, and very little is known of this animal or its ecosystem. The Tarachunka is an important member of the cultural, religious, and ecological caste of the island. The Picardiant are a reclusive people and very protective of their home and neighbors, so this mystery surrounding this and other residents of the island is understandable. While many in the assembly know study of this animal could answer many questions about elephant evolution, respect for one of their most vocal allies in Kaimere has meant the assembly are content to let any questions its study might answer remain a mystery. Cheers to Ian for sponsoring this episode. The Picardian Mastadon has a long and precarious history in Kaimere. As many of my longtime viewers know, I've not had this mentioned often in previous episodes. It was an old concept that I cut before starting the channel. Indeed, when I first drew Pakardia, there were mastodon on the island, largely because of the mastodon at the Museum of the Earth at which I was a docent for a couple of years in middle and early high school. As I developed the island more in college, I cut many large mammals from the project with the idea that dinosaurs would prohibit their success. Over the years, as I'm sure you've noticed, I've walked back on this mentality, and mammals are a much more level playing field in many niches, save for the largest predators and herbivores, which are still quite claimed by the dinosaurs. Yes, I think it's fair to say that mammals almost certainly needed to have a clean slate in order to become big, and the dinosaurs prevented that on Earth, but Kaimere is not a natural ecosystem, at least not in the known world. Mammals in harvests from the Oligocene onward came to Kaimere already at competitive sizes. I don't think the dominance of dinosaurs keeping mammals small in the Mesozoic would apply if they met one another in the same weight class. Dinosaurs beat mammals on Earth because they got big first. There are likely other factors, but it could be that simple. In my studies, I have come to a pretty strongly held conviction. While an animal traits can certainly play a role in their success, and some innovations like the amniote egg on Earth or the metabolism of heterotherms in Kaimere are certainly game changers, at the end of the day, I think luck is often the most important factor. I don't think there's anything special about dinosaurs or mammals that would make their success inevitable. They had the right suite of characteristics to thrive at the right time, and I think it's a folly of bias to think what happened is on Earth is what is inevitable. In a Kaimere with fewer harvests, the familiar trajectory we saw on Earth would likely be the case, wherein generally a region would see a few lineages achieve dominance, and only when land bridges form do you see increased diversity. On the scale of the known world, with two converging continents having their own megafaunal biota, combined with regular harvest from Earth, I think this scenario would be far less likely to see a single clade, dinosaur, or mammal completely dominate. Both had large competitive contestants coming to the ecological arena. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that both would win its share of niches. Anyway, with that rambling aside, I decided it made sense for a mastodon to make home in Pakardia. There's an abundance of its preferred food, and I've already established them in Kajar and Kadan, so joining the numerous animals crossing to Pakardia 1.5 million years ago seemed perfectly reasonable. I appreciate this may frustrate fans who desire a consistent canon. That is eventually my goal. However, for now, this project is a work in progress. Only the books are definite canon. The rest is subject to change. As with last month's Trilobite episodes, I wanted to give a quick shout out to the Museum of the Earth. Their mastodon skeleton was very useful in getting some of the finer details right, along with pictures I took of Asian elephants at the Syracuse Zoo. The Museum of the Earth has fallen on hard times, and I've included their donation page in the description of this episode. You've heard me mention mastodons in other regions of Kaimere. Kajar was their last holdout on the mainland continents, though they went extinct with the arrival of the first children some 12 to 13,000 years ago. In our next episode, airing 2 weeks from now, we will learn about these events and what Kajar was like prior to this arrival. We will meet the mainland mastodons, and many other new species that once lived in these forests and prairies of the Kajarith Peninsula. Thanks again to Ian, to my Patreon patrons for making this project possible, and thank you so much for watching. Cheers, folks!